It's your host, La Doctora Janice Castro. Welcome, welcome. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let y'all know that if you are BIPOC identified adult with ADHD and you want to share your story as a guest on the Latine ADHD podcast, come on through. You can fill out a Google form that's in the show notes of this podcast episode, or you can go to my website, www.drjanicecastro.com, to get access to the Google form, and we'll see if we can get you on here. On today's episode, we have a good friend of mine, Joel Orozco, who is a doctoral student out in Colorado and a late diagnosed ADHDer. He talks about his journey, what it was like before he got his diagnosis, what led him to want to get a diagnosis, and then once he got the diagnosis, what happened? You'll find out. He also brings the perspective as a director of a program at his university and talks about the importance of what can staff, faculty do to be more mindful on how to be able to support ADHD students. So let's get into it. Today we have Joel Orozco Almeida. Is that how I pronounce it?
Yes, you got it right.
All right, good. Joel is originally from Yepomera, Chihuahua, Mexico. Did I pronounce Yepomera?
You actually did, yes.
Oh,
yes.
okay, good.
Yes.
And moved to the U.S. when he was 15. He obtained a bachelor's in behavioral science from the Metropolitan State University of Denver and a master's in education administration in student affairs from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Currently, he is a PhD student in the Higher Educational Leadership Program at Colorado State University. Joel has spent the past decade working in multiple roles, directly supporting historically disenfranchised student populations on college campuses, and works at Colorado State University, where he serves as the director for College Assistance Migrant Program. Thank you so much for being here, Joel.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here because I think the topic that we get to discuss today is something that I'm passionate about, and also, just so we need to talk more often. So I'm excited to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Of course. For some of our listeners who may not know, Joel and I are very good friends, and we met at the University of Nebraska. So I'm curious to start off. When did you get diagnosed? What was going on at the time?
Yeah, actually, that you mentioned that we met at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I do want to take us there. I want to answer this question in kind of two-parter, a two-part, if you will, focus. So one, just like how it actually happened that I got diagnosed, and also I think it was very emotionally, and so just like the feelings that came with that I think it's important to mention. The way that I got first tested was when I actually started grad school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And something important to mention is part of the reason I was able to get tested is because for the first time, my assistantship came with health insurance. With health insurance, I actually started seeing counseling. So it was a rough transition, just moving to a new state and grad school. And I started through counseling. So I'm actually really thankful because my counselor was the who referred me to actually work with a psychiatrist. And they mentioned like, your health insurance actually covers this. So I was like, oh, great. So why not? I've always had maybe, I don't want to call it like suspicions, but yeah. So I did realize that I had difficulty sometimes concentrating and things like that. And I always attributed that to English being my second language, or maybe thinking maybe my brain wasn't stimulated as much as a child. I always just had that, but I was like, I have this opportunity and really grateful to have access to that. So I actually met with a psychiatrist, and I think it was 3 different sessions that I had to go and do like a series of testing. And
how
then
old were you back then?
Gosh, 24. Yes. So it was more later in life in terms of I went through my whole undergraduate experience I guess not knowing, but yes, definitely I was 24. Yeah, so the other piece I want to share is just more the feeling maybe that came with that. So there's this notion of feeling maybe validated. Okay, maybe there was something there this whole entire time. And so I feel validated, like that it wasn't just maybe me or maybe not feeling smart enough or always trying to come up with the different skills. Like I mentioned, English is my second language. That's what's going on. I also felt, and I don't know, maybe upset or disappointed was like the best word to share, but again, just knowing that I went through my whole undergraduate experience, that I had these and just thinking, I don't know, there was just a feeling, always feeling like not good enough or things like that. There's no, there was always something there. And what are some maybe services that I could have been qualified? And also, after talking to a psychiatrist, we went into talking about you have actually options. And one of those things was about medication. And at the beginning, I was very hesitant about that too. There was just a lot of information all at once. And I just needed a minute to just kind of process and feel validated. But also, I was in my feelings and feeling also upset all at the same time. And I did just mention, let's come back about this medication thing. And eventually I did with medication. I'm happy to talk a little more about that. But yes, it was grad school. I was
Yeah.
24 and there was a lot of mixed feelings that came with the actual diagnosis.
Yeah, for sure. What you described, having experienced this diagnosis as an adult, having gone through undergrad, throughout your
Mhm.
schooling, you mentioned
Mhm.
wondering as a kid, maybe I'm just not stimulated enough, which
Yes.
is one of those things that comes up for ADHD is getting bored easily,
Mhm.
getting distracted, and
Mhm.
because of not having enough dopamine. And
Mhm.
then thinking of how when you did get the diagnosis, feeling disappointed, but also validated all at
Yeah.
once. And being curious. You mentioned maybe
Yeah.
having just some suspicion of something's up, but you don't know
Yes.
what's up until you
Right.
get that formal diagnosis. And you get the formal diagnosis after you meet with, you mentioned a psychiatrist, you did some
Yep.
testing,
Yep.
and you couldn't even get that testing until you got some insurance,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a lot.
Yes, it was. It was quite a lot. And again, super thankful for the fact that I was able to get to that point. But then again, what's the back of my head is so there could have been a lot of unnecessary, or there was a lot of harm that could have been prevented. And so
Mm.
that was just, and that's maybe the disappointed or maybe upset part that definitely came with that. So, yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm curious, what do you mean by some harm that maybe could have been avoided?
I think like it comes a lot with just I don't know if like maybe not even like self-worth, but even knowing that it was okay to be different or like my journey was going to be different in my mind I always thought maybe I just don't process things the way that other so maybe feeling less than and if I known that there was just there's something different I think especially like now later on in life, learning the different tools that I had, like all of those times that I was maybe upset or maybe doubting myself or feeling that I was less than others, that could have been avoided because now I've been able to master different with different tools. And I'm like, no, I can still do the work. I just do it differently. And I think, especially looking at my other identities from, again, being English being my second language or being a Latino and trying to navigate like higher education that is already designed not to especially for me, someone with this identity is to not thrive and still being able to have those pieces. It just added more to these feelings of maybe not belonging. Are you even, should you even be here? And here's the signs that you're not doing well. And it had nothing to do with my abilities and everything to do with the environment that I was in and having to do things differently. So I just felt all of those things could have been avoided, or at least I could have been consciously aware about those things. And I think I would have had a completely different experience of how I maybe showed up in spaces or just asking for the things that I needed. But again, that wasn't happening. I didn't have this awareness. And I might be jumping into maybe some other pieces, but then just even being able to access resources that could have made things a world of difference. The thing that comes to mind is even extra testing time. I think like it was just those pieces like that could have been avoided. Like all of those things could have been avoided. And I think my experience would have been just a completely different in a more positive way. So
Yeah, you bring up such great points because when you're trying to navigate these systems, these environments
yeah.
in growing up, and they're not built for people with ADHD,
Mhm.
then you start to question yourself. And then
Right.
it starts to affect, you said, maybe your self worth or your
Yeah.
self esteem, your confidence around, is it me? Right? Am I not smart enough? Am I
Right.
not good enough?
Right.
Wondering, is it the language barrier? And so it's, you constantly start to personalize. Very rarely is somebody like, oh, it's the environment I'm in,
Right.
when really it's a lot of how, because you didn't know you had the diagnosis, then it turns into you not having the support that you needed,
Right.
because you think differently and you learn
Right.
differently. And like you gave an example, that extra time with
Yeah.
testing, and how these different strategies that could have been implemented throughout your
Yeah.
upbringing, maybe then you wouldn't be questioning, am I good enough? Am I
Right.
smart enough? Or is
Right.
this my language?
Right.
So that leads me to my next question. You got your diagnosis at 24 when you were out
Hmm.
in Nebraska getting your master's degree.
Correct.
And then while in grad school, it can be very challenging. It's a lot, right?
Yes.
And so, with the demands of being in a doctoral program, what are some of the challenges you faced just throughout grad school, maybe before you knew you had ADHD? And then how did it look different after you got the diagnosis? So, yeah, if you could speak to the contrast of what was it like before you got the diagnosis? What were some of the challenges? And then after you got some of the support, what tips and tools helped?
Yeah. Through undergrad, one of the things that happened is that I was never a full-time student for one. I was at the time paying out-of-state tuition through my whole undergrad. I wasn't never really able to take a full course load. And once I got to grad school, and because of my assistantship, it was like, you are here full time. So throughout my undergrad, I had to go as a part-time student, I think for multiple reasons, but I think that also helped with the demand of the work that I had to do, because there's so many extra things that I feel I had to do than other students necessarily didn't, maybe had to, or that I observed. Okay, so you just read through that and then you retain all that information. And to me, there was a lot of mastering all these study skills, from like, I have to color code things and read and reread again. And it just took me longer to do so for all the activities. Imagine if I was a full-time student, how can I even be a full-time student? So even that piece was like the questioning piece. But yeah, so once I got to grad school, it's like, you're actually have this privilege having assistantship. So you do have to be full-time. And now you got to produce the work, if you will. And I think that was one of the biggest pieces. Like, I knew how I developed skills throughout my undergrad, and I just knew that it was going to be very time consuming. So from the reading and then taking notes and then putting those notes into my own words and trying to repetition and all these different things that I knew that I needed to do in order to retain the information. It was just so very time consuming. And I still had an assistantship and a couple other responsibilities. So it just became very overwhelming. And that's actually one of the reasons why I ended up in counseling to begin
Mm.
with. And I think it was a serendipity. It was like meant to be, because then again, thanks to counseling, then I was able to get tested and have some different pieces. So yeah, it was just more challenging for me. It's more the focusing and knowing how I got through undergrad, and it was having to do all these extra things just to be able to, what I would call, be the average student, or at least what kind of what I observed my peers being able to do. That I was like, oh, I wish I could just read once and then I retained that information, and I knew it was a lot longer. So things that kind of changed that once I got diagnosis was I did went back and talked to the psychiatrist. Is okay, tell me more about this like medication thing. How does this work? And I think there's also a lot of pieces around how I was brought up in terms of Western medication, or even just medication in general, that I was very hesitant. And there's oftentimes this narrative around, oh, you're gonna get hooked on medication, and how are you
Mm.
gonna be reliant on medication? So there's been a lot of learning that had to happen. And also part of that was just doing my own research and actually learning what is it that, and learning, oh, it's actually like chemical imbalance, and this is actually gonna kind of balance as, oh, okay, so I may have to be taking medication for a while, but this is not something to get hooked on. So it took some time to doing some research and also just asking questions. But yeah, so a couple of things that happened was I did register with the Office of Student Disability Services. And so from the extra testing time and even just learning, one of the biggest change things for me was being able to have access to adaptive learning software, that it just made a world of difference, from being able to upload PDFs from my lecture or from my readings, and be able to extract information and be able to hear it instead of hearing it and as I was reading it. So it's just a plethora of adaptive learning software that in of itself was game changer, where I would be reading for a chapter would take me through this process that I was into extra information. I cut back on half of the time. And by having software technology help me with that, or the text to speak, it was just a plethora of adaptive learning software. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So that in of itself was a game changer for me to be able to get to the point that I needed to be and still that fit within this ritual that I have to do the readings. But because of technology, I was able to cut the time back. And the other pieces, I did notice a big difference after taking medication in terms of my ability to retain information or just like capture information. So I think a combination between medication and just having access to adaptive learning software, it was definitely a game changer for me. And then in conjunction with other tips that I've learned, I think that I was more out of necessity, especially in undergrad from, I knew if I have to read, I have to have natural sunlight. I know that now. So I don't even go anywhere else because if I'm reading, I have to have natural sunlight. So I have to look for a spot. Yeah, I learned that having dedicated space for writing at home, that is a must. I had to literally dedicate a whole corner I need. That is a non-negotiable. And if I do have to be not on my desk, I have to have a whole table. I have to have my multicolor pen and highlighters. So I have this ritual. I have to listen to classical music. And I think a lot of these things came with just testing and what's working, what's not working, where am I more productive, where I'm less productive. And I do rely a lot on tools to keep me organized from my calendar or even run out as a researcher. I use Zotero, which is my citation where I can dump everything electronically, or for coding, I use to do. There's all this software that I rely on to be able to be more efficient and be able to get the things that I need to get done by using technology. So I'm really thankful for that piece. And I think the other tip that I would also share would be, for me, it's very important to write things down, because if I feel like if I write it down, it's real now. So I actually put things on my calendar. I have to schedule a time because to do some writing time, or right now I'm at the writing stage, but before when I was doing coursework for reading time, block that. Or if I have to go to the writing center, I needed to block this in my calendar.
Did you block this on your calendar this
I did
time?
block this. Like I needed
Good.
to.
Me
Yes.
too. Me too.
Yes. And other things from I do also know that I have to take breaks. So I have to set up timers if it's after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. And I don't know if it's because I'm still on medication, but usually my medication kind of starts running like around more in the evening. So I know I'm not going to be as productive. So I try to maximize the morning. That's where I get my most productive work, which comes with, because I can't really do much in the evenings during the week, but I also have to dedicate more on the weekends because I can really maximize my mornings, or take time off of work if that's needed. And another thing too that I like to share is after finishing my master's, there was about a 5-year period where I didn't start my PhD. And once I started back my PhD, I talked to my doctor and said, I need medication that is gonna last me a little bit longer, especially working full time for coursework. It happened after 5 p.m. So we up my dosage, and I think that also helped with the wearing off not being until later in the day. So I was really thankful for that. So those are just some tips that I been able to gather from, first of all, my undergrad. I just learned some study tips, I guess, study skills, and then complementing that now with fully being having access to all the resources through the Office of Student Disability Services and medication. It's been a game changer for me, which is, I don't know, I'm really thankful for those things. So yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, because when you were describing how you were managing prior to the diagnosis, the highlighting, the repetition, rereading, often what I hear from people with ADHD is that they'll overcompensate to try to keep up with the rest of their classmates. And that overcompensation meaning that maybe you have to reread things more, having to take very detailed notes because you'll forget, and using different colors to highlight stuff, making it colorful. I'm hearing that what led to your diagnosis was that then those tools in undergrad weren't working for you as much anymore. Often that ends up happening a lot too with adults with ADHD, is they overcompensate and keep it moving. And then maybe it's a transition into something different in their life, maybe a new stressor that they haven't faced. And then all of a sudden, these tools that used to work, they're not working anymore. Why are they not working anymore? And so thankfully, instead of just sitting there frustrated, you sought
Mhm.
out help.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of courage to ask for help, especially when you brought up how there is a stigma when it comes to mental health and medication. For myself, there was a point during grad school, I had started antidepressants because I was
Mm.
experiencing some depressive
Yeah.
episodes.
Yeah.
When I got told by my therapist, you're depressed, and she recommended I meet with a psychiatrist, I was judging myself hard. And I
Yeah.
was in a counseling psychology program
Right,
and I was
right.
still judging myself. And
Yes,
I was
yes.
like, oh man, like it got to this point where I need medication. Am
Right.
I not? What, how did it get that bad? Or why is it that the efforts that I'm putting in aren't enough? They're not enough. And so I need medication to help me. Like I was
Yeah.
judging hard. And it just speaks to how within our Latine community, there is a stigma around mental
Hmm.
health services,
Absolutely.
medication, and concern that it's para los locos or there's
Yep.
something really bad for you
Yeah.
to take medication. But I am hearing, and not just from you, but for many people with ADHD, that medication can make a world of a difference. And
Absolutely.
you mentioned the disability services office on
Yep.
campus, being able to get connected to these offices as resources to help you
Yes.
learn what can work for you, right? You mentioned
Yeah.
these adapted technology programs that can
Yep.
help you with the reading, the writing.
Yep.
You mentioned something super important, which is how you try to control your environment to work best for you.
Yes.
Being able to be in a certain area in your home to work,
Yep.
making sure you got that direct sunlight, and then
Yep.
consulting with your psychiatrist of, okay, I'm going to need some kind of different medication or a different
Yep.
dosage, especially with those evening classes from grad
Yes.
school. When you mentioned that, I
Yes.
almost forgot. I almost
Yes.
forgot. I've been out of
Yes.
school so long. I was like, oh, I do not miss that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think yeah, I think you're like on the yes, right on the money there with the things that have shared. I think I do want to like circle back on the piece around the stigma around yes, even the medication like that hit me hard, and especially as one of those things that I said do as I told, not as I say. And when it's about yourself, for me, that was very difficult to, and I did not know how I was gonna feel about that until it happened. Because I think that's important because even for me, I learned about things and learn about student development, yes, and referring and all that stuff. But then when it was about me, it hit different, and took me a minute to just kind of process and also just process where is this coming from. And that was important for me to also explore the root cause and also just validate that this is something new and it's different, but also is this coming from a space of what I've been told or been in condition and what is it that I need to do different. And that's why I was like, I need to do more research or what this looks like and what it is. And I don't think we oftentimes do that as much. And but yeah, that was real, especially as like the piece around I tell others to do it, but then when it's about for me, when it's about myself, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what's happening. But
Oh.
yes, yeah. And with the Latina community, that's real. That's very real.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I want us to finish off with this last question. You've dedicated much of your career to supporting historically oppressed and marginalized student
Yeah.
population. What advice would you give to Latinx students with ADHD who are trying to make it through college? How can they advocate for themselves and get the help that they need to do well both in school and in life?
So I'm thinking of two pieces, both for students, but I think especially as someone who works at the professional, and I'm for folks who might be hearing these, maybe you're not in school, but maybe you work at a school, or are you're in a
Oh,
role where you
yeah.
get to help students. Um, so I think I'd like to maybe share a couple of tips for as a student, but also as someone who works with these students and things that
Yeah.
can be done because I think that's important to mention too. So I'll start with I think the very first thing is just that I would say to students is just validating that their journey is likely to look different. And just because you have HDD does not make them like less smart. It just means that they'll have to do things differently and differently than the norm, whatever that norm is. And I think just like validating is like just because your journey looks different, it's not less valid or it counts less. And so oftentimes we have this comparison. At least for me, it's always this constant comparison to like my peers. And I think it's part of it's because how we are socialized and we start making things in our head. And so again, just like validating your journeys look different, and that is okay. That doesn't make you less than smart. It's just differently. And if folks who have the access to getting testing and I would say, I'm sure it's probably like community places where they can maybe get like a sliding scale to be able to get the service, because I think it's important to name that this can cost money. And especially for me, like I mentioned, I didn't have access to get tested until literally grad school, and it was because I until I was had access to insurance. But I think even then, for folks who oftentimes do have access to insurance, that sometimes there's this hesitancy to even get tested. So just normalizing, if you have some suspicions there and if you have access, then just do it. I think for me, it was very, yes, devastating, but also like super validating. But the benefits I got from it, like it was just exponentially great. And the only thing I can think is what would have looked like again if it was been younger. So if you have the means, do it. Don't hesitate. Because for me at least, it's been super, super rewarding for that piece. And I think the other pieces that I also had this mindset shift, that it wasn't about me taking advantage of the system or say, "Ay, pobrecito, you're like less than," but it's just about leveling the playing field. And I think
Mm,
that kind of helped me understand I am not asking for more. I'm just trying to level the playing field. So like my peers are not distracted very easily. So therefore they're able to concentrate or maybe learn more. So that's all we're doing. I'm just trying to level the playing field so I can be in the same. So that kind of that changing that mindset and putting things into perspective, that's also helpful to for me to put into perspective, if you will. I think the other thing that I think like it's important to do both as a student, but even if you work with students, is creating spaces where we can normalize that it's okay to ask for your needs and ask what those needs are. And that could be very difficult. And especially when we start talking about like intersecting identities of, again, for me being Latino, coming from immigrant background or having other identities, as like, can I even have this space to even share or hear my voice? So inviting others to share and normalize. There's people who have HDAD and this is how it manifests. And then the other piece would be important to also communicate that if you do have someone who has communicating that with those around you, and even taking it a further step, because I think at one point I was communicating, oh yes, I do have HDAD, but I wasn't maybe necessarily asking what I needed from them. And that was specifically harder with family members when I had to, even if I did came home for the holidays and I still had to do some homework, and I did have to leave the house and go to maybe the library and go to my routine, and even trying to explain, so you're here, but you're not here, and just having to communicate, this is what I need from you. And it came with time. I think also maybe because I was in grad school, that might help a little bit. But I think that's another step that is important. Communicate what are your needs, and most important, maybe what you need from other folks. For example, for my instructors, because I use adaptive learning software, and in order for me to upload it to the software when I had to go to class, not only it had to be like readable PDFs, and sometimes they wouldn't share with me the readable PDFs, and it was just more like coaching thing that maybe I had to bring up to my professors, like, yes, you are technically sending me the PDFs, but they're not readable PDFs. And this is how you format it in order to be a readable PDF, because then the software that I use won't pick up the information on that. So again, just communicating and sometimes it is about coaching those around you, what are the needs are, and what those things can look like. Because in this case of the professors, I was like, yes, you're technically meeting by law what you have to do, but there's this piece that is still that you're missing, and also the timing. I need that at least a day in advance, because then I have to upload it to software pieces, like I mentioned. So again, the self-advocating, but also communicating to folks that you have this, but sometimes even communicating what you need and what that looks like, and sometimes doing that coaching. And then the last piece too that I wanted to share, oftentimes when we have a conversation about HDAD, or at least for me, has always been from this deficit lens of like, especially maybe being more inattentive. I think oftentimes it can be put into this deficit of you always need help or whatnot. But I think one good thing that came out of that is I had to start relying on what I would call cultural wealth of knowledge of things that how I learn best, and be able to embrace those things has been like great. So for example, for me, storytelling, it's something that I retain more information. So now I know that hearing to like lectures or hearing an audiobook, it's how I'm going to retain better information. And it is because I just grew up in such a culture that it's about storytelling. And I think there's tools that are like, you know what, it is a little bit different than maybe what other people do, but this is part of my culture, how I grew up and how I best learn. And I think we need to also talk about, I think it's important to talk about how, or at least for me as a person of color or someone who grew up in a different country and a different culture and being able to embrace these tools of like cultural wealth that has helped me with my HDAD and normalize. I've been, yes, the storytelling has been a huge part of who I am, and I should rely on that tool. And what then to me that's audiobooks now. And usually I have, if I can, and what I do is I have to, as I'm reading, I have to also have somebody is dictating. So it's like a double, like I'm seeing it and I'm hearing it, and that just helps me hugely retain information. And again, it's luckily for the adaptive software technology that I get that I'm follow along, I'm reading and hearing it at the same time. And it's so I just wanted to mention, while I think for me, it is okay to do things differently. And not only I get to now bring these tools and part of like my cultural piece. And the one piece that I mentioned is the storytelling. And what a beautiful thing it is to now, because of this, being able to embrace that. Because I think there are good things that not necessarily come out of having HDAD, but like that you get to discover, or that I got to discover for myself, and at the same time, simultaneously be able to embrace all these capita that I do have, like cultural capita that I do have, that oftentimes can be seen as a deficit, and it's actually becoming, it's how now become that this practice now become like a tool for me to use. And how cool is that? So just maybe wanted to mention that too, because yeah, again, just this notion of oftentimes talking about from these really deficit lens, but there has been some really cool things that I have learned about myself and reclaim and regain because of it. So just wanted to surface that, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. I'm hearing the importance of being able to let people know who you feel comfortable and trusting of, so that you feeling empowered to having that coaching piece to let people know this is how you can support me. And then for you to even know what to tell them to support you has also it's been a journey for you to figure out and learn what works best for you. And I love how you brought up this piece about not looking at it from a deficit, but rather trying to reframe. And it's so hard because even the word deficits within the name, right? And to reframe that and look at it from a different perspective and look at that cultural wealth, the storytelling that is ingrained within the Latina culture, and you coming from Chihuahua, Mexico, and just embracing that culture and knowing what works. And I think that all of these suggestions that you provide are such great tools and strategies. So thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think the last question I would cover some things, but I think if there's some takeaways, if you will, is again the normalizing that it's okay to do things differently, and that it's not, that doesn't make people like less than or less smart. It just means that you have to do different and normalize that it's okay to be different and find what's the niche for folks. And yeah, and again, just taking this different approach of both owning, yes, this is something that I have and it doesn't define me. And yeah, to taking ownership of that. And yeah, so I think this is for me, this has been this journey of reclaim and like liberation of just, yes, owning it. And it's easier said than done. It's been a journey. And I think a lot of it has been because of counseling and just learning the tools that I have gained. And I think that the piece with that is that like, I'll often have to keep reminding myself or keeping folks around me that once I start feeling like sometimes we're just like, no, and it's okay to not to be, and it's okay to not be okay, or that things have to be done a little bit differently. Since I have to continue to catch myself, because there is times where I was like, oh, like I'm struggling. It's a struggle, and yeah. So a lot of that keep reminding myself or having folks around me that can remind me of you're doing great. So yeah, that part.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. It was such a pleasure to be able to have Joel Orozco talk about his journey with ADHD as a late diagnosed adult and how he navigates it as a student. But also, I really appreciated how vulnerable he was about the mixed emotions that come up once you find out that you have ADHD. And then also, it doesn't have to do with being not smart enough or not good enough, but rather it's about the environment that you're in and how do we make that environment work for you. Also, he brought in this perspective as a director of a program at the university. So he thinks about it as what can faculty and staff do for students with ADHD? and collaborating with the disability services at the university. And just as a reminder, I am a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. So this is not a replacement for therapy.